What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Hello, Brave Souls. I've been reading a ton of Stephen King lately, and I wanted to have a zombie-inspired Stephen King style story, so I hope you guys enjoy this one. It's called The Last Light of Milfield. The first thing Ray Brennan noticed wasn't the screaming. That came later. When Mrs. Henderson from next door started making sounds no human throat should make. No. The first thing Ray noticed was how quiet his coffee maker was. He stood in his kitchen that Tuesday morning, October 15th, watching the ancient Mr. Coffee wheeze and gurgle like it had for the past 8 years. But somehow the sound seemed muffled, distant, as if he was hearing it through cotton batting. The morning light filtered through his checkered curtains looked wrong, too. Not dimmer, exactly, but somehow thinner. Like butter scraped over too much bread, his mother would have said. God rest her paranoid soul. Ray had been a mail carrier in Milfield, Maine, for 23 years. He knew every dog, every gate latch, every resident who left tips at Christmas, and everyone who complained about late deliveries. He knew the rhythm of his small town like a heartbeat. And this morning, that heartbeat was off. The coffee finished brewing with a final, strangled burp. Ray poured himself a mug. The one his ex-wife Sarah had given him that read, "World's okayest dad," and took his usual spot at the kitchen table where he could see both the street and his backyard. The Hendersons' house sat quiet next door, which was unusual. Bill Henderson was typically in his driveway by 6:30 a.m., warming up his truck with the dedication of a man who believed in the sanctity of routine. Ray sipped his coffee and waited. Patience was something you learned in his line of work. People had rhythms, patterns, and when those patterns broke, you noticed. The coffee was bitter, more bitter than usual, and it left an aftertaste that reminded him of copper pennies. At 6:45 a.m., he saw some movement in the Hendersons' backyard. Bill was there, but he wasn't warming up his truck. He was standing perfectly still in his bathrobe, staring at something near their garden shed. Even from 50 yards away, Ray could see that Bill's posture was wrong. Too rigid, like a man carved from wood. Ray knocked on the window. "Morning, Bill!" Bill Henderson turned toward the sound, and Ray's coffee mug slipped from his finger. It hit the linoleum floor and shattered, sending hot coffee and ceramic shards across his kitchen. But Ray barely noticed. He was too busy staring at what used to be his neighbor. Bill's face had gone gray, the color of old concrete, and his eyes. Jesus Christ. His eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye. Like someone had filled the sockets with crude oil. But he was moving, walking toward Ray's window with jerky, unnatural steps, his mouth hanging open to reveal teeth that seemed too sharp and too many. Ray stumbled backwards, his heel catching a piece of broken mug. He went down hard, his shoulder blade connecting with the kitchen counter edge with a crack that sent lightning through his nervous system. When he scrambled back to his feet and looked out the window, Bill was gone. The phone was ringing. Ray answered it with shaking hands. "Hello?"
Ray, thank God.
It was Martha from the post office, and she sounded like she'd been crying.
Don't go outside. Whatever you do, don't go outside.
"Martha, what?"
They're sick, Ray. Everyone's sick. Started about an hour ago. They're changing. The radio says stay inside. Lock your doors. The National Guard is coming, but...
The line went dead. Ray tried calling back, but got only a busy signal. He tried 911. Busy signal. His daughter in Portland. Busy signal. It was as if the world had simply stopped talking. He He moved through his house like a man in a dream, checking locks, pulling curtains closed. His hands moved automatically. Deadbolt in the front door, chain lock, the security bar he'd installed after the break-ins last summer, the back door, same routine. Windows locked, blinds drawn. It was while he was checking the basement window that he heard Mrs. Henderson start screaming. The sound was coming from next door, high and wavering, like a tea kettle left too long on the stove. But underneath that inhuman shriek was something worse. A wet, tearing sound, like fabric ripping, but heavier, meatier. Ray found himself at his living room window, peering through a crack in the blinds. The Henderson house looked normal from the outside. White clapboard siding, green shutters. The American flag bill flew from a pole by their front steps. But the screaming was definitely coming from inside, and it was getting louder. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming. Ray stood at his window, watching, waiting, his breath fogging the glass. Minutes passed. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, then stopped abruptly. A car alarm went off 3 streets over, wailed for 30 seconds, and cut out mid-shriek. The front door of the Henderson house opened. What came out used to be Mrs. Henderson. Ray could tell by the pink bathrobe and the gray curls in her hair. But everything else was wrong. She moved like Bill had, with that awful, jerky gait. And when she turned toward Ray's house, he saw that her face had gone the same concrete gray, her eyes the same oil-slick black. Her mouth was open, revealing those 2 sharp teeth, and something dark was dripping from her chin. She started walking toward Ray's house. Ray backed away from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. Think, goddammit, think! He was 62 years old, 20 pounds overweight, with a bad knee from his army days and hands that shook from too much coffee. He wasn't built for whatever this was. Mrs. Henderson reached his front door and began pounding on it. Not knocking, pounding, with both fists. A steady rhythm that made the whole door shake in its frame. She made no sound except for that wet breathing. But the pounding went on and on. Ray grabbed the phone again. Still no dial tone. He tried his cell phone, but there was no signal. The pounding continued, patient and mechanical, like a machine that would never tire. He was checking his kitchen windows when he saw one of them. They came from all directions, shambling figures in bathrobes and pajamas, moving with that same broken puppet gait. He recognized faces. Tom Brewster from the hardware store, his gray hair still standing up from sleep. The Kowalski twins from Pine Street, moving in perfect unison like some nightmare ballet. Old Mr. Patch from the corner store, still wearing the oxygen tank he'd been tethered to since his emphysema got bad, the clear tubes dangling from his nostrils like dead snakes. All of them had those black eyes. All of them had those 2 sharp teeth. And all of them were coming toward his house. Ray ran to his bedroom and pulled out the shotgun he kept in his closet, a Remington 870 his father had given him for his 16th birthday. He'd used it for hunting deer, turkey, and the occasional coyote that got too close to the garbage cans. Never thought he'd need it for this. The shells were on the top shelf of his closet, and his hand shook so badly he dropped the box twice before managing to load the gun. 5 shells. He had a box of 25, but the way his hands were trembling, 5 would have to do for now. The pounding on his front door had been joined by similar sounds from other directions. They were at his back door now. His windows, completely surrounding the house. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic, like some primitive drum beat. Ray moved to his living room window and peered out again. There had to be 20 of them now, maybe more. They stood in his yard on the driveway, in the street, all of them facing his house. All of them perfectly still, except for those at the doors and windows who continued their mechanical pounding. As he watched, more arrived. The postman. Jesus. It was Jerry Kowalski, his replacement on the Pine Street route. The Methodist minister, Reverend Pike, still in his black suit from when? Yesterday's funeral? The banker, the grocery store clerk, the high school principal, people he'd known for years, decades, some of them, all transformed into these gray, black-eyed things. But they weren't trying to break in. Not really. They were just waiting, pounding steadily, patiently, like they had all the time in the world. That's when Ray understood. They didn't need to break in. They were waiting for him to come out, or waiting for him to become like them. He thought about Martha's call. Started an hour ago, she said. What had started? Some kind of disease? A gas leak? A terrorist attack? Ray had read about things like that. Biological weapons that could affect brain chemistry, make people violent, even insane. But this felt different. This felt wrong in a way that went deeper than science, deeper than logic. This felt like something that belonged to the old stories his grandmother used to tell him. The ones about things that came in the night and took people away to places where the sun never rose. The pounding stopped. Ray pressed his face to the window, trying to see what was happening. The creatures. He couldn't think of them as people anymore. Not with those eyes, or those teeth. Were all turning away from his house. They moved in unison, like a school of fish changing direction, and they were all looking toward the center of town. From somewhere in the distance came a sound Ray had never heard before. A low, humming note that seemed to come from underground, from the very earth itself. It was felt as much as heard, a vibration that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. The creatures began to move, all of them, flowing like water toward whatever was calling them. Within minutes, Ray's yard was empty. The street was empty. The only sound was that distant thrumming, growing louder. Ray waited another 10 minutes before he dared to move away from the window. He checked every lock again, tested every window, made sure the curtains were tightly drawn. Then he went to the kitchen, swept up the broken coffee mug with hands that still shook, and tried to think. The radio. He'd forgotten about the radio. Ray kept an old transistor radio in his junk drawer, left over from his camping days with Sarah. It took him 5 minutes to find batteries that weren't corroded, another 2 to get the thing working. Most stations were dead air, but he finally picked up something. A voice, distant and crackling with static.
National emergency has been declared. All civilians are advised to remain in their homes and await evacuation by military personnel. Do not attempt to help anyone exhibiting symptoms of the infection. Symptoms include pallor, altered eye pigmentation, aggressive behavior, and...
The signal faded to static. Ray tried other stations, but found only 2 more with any broadcast at all. One was just someone reading what sounded like biblical verses over and over. The other was a man crying and calling for his mother. Neither lasted long. As afternoon faded to evening, Ray ate a cold dinner of canned soup and crackers. His appetite gone, but his body demanding fuel. He'd been in combat, Desert Storm, a lifetime ago. And he remembered the way fear could hollow you out, leave you weak and shaking. Food was medicine. Sleep was medicine. Staying alert was medicine. The thrumming sound had faded around sunset, but it had been replaced by something worse. Absolute silence. No cars, no dogs barking, no children playing. Milfield had become a town full of held breath. Ray tried to sleep on his living room couch, the shotgun across his lap, but every small sound made him jolt awake. The house settling, a branch snapping against the roof, the hum of his refrigerator cycling on and off. Around midnight, he heard voices. They were distant, muffled, but definitely human, and definitely not the gray creatures from the morning. Ray crept to his front window and peered through the blinds. A group of people were moving down his street, keeping to the shadows. Real people, not the changed ones. He could see the beam of a flashlight, quickly covered when someone hissed a warning. They were heading toward the center of town. moving carefully but with purpose. Ray made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He unlocked his front door. "Hey," he called in a loud whisper. "Hey, over here!" The group stopped. Ray could see them better now. 5 people, maybe 6. A woman with a rifle, a teenage boy clutching what looked like a baseball bat, an elderly man leaning heavily on a walking stick. "You okay in there?" the woman called back. "Yeah, for now. What's happening? Where is everyone?" "Dead or changed," the woman said. "We're heading to the school. Someone's got a radio set up there, trying to coordinate with the outside. You should come." Ray looked at his house. His safe, familiar house with its locked doors and drawn curtains. Then he looked at the group of survivors. Real live human beings in a world that had gone insane. "Give me 2 minutes," he said. Ray grabbed his jacket, stuffed his pockets with shotgun shells, and picked up a flashlight and a bottle of water. At the door, he paused, looking back at his living room, his kitchen, his comfortable old couch. 23 years he'd lived in this house. 23 years of routine mornings and quiet evenings, of coffee and crossword puzzles and the gentle predictability of small-town life. All gone now. All changed. Ray stepped outside and locked the door behind him, though he knew he'd never be coming back. The group welcomed him with nods and whispered introductions. The woman with the rifle was Sarah Chen, a state trooper he'd met a few times. The teenager was Billy Morrison, whose mother had been Ray's dentist. The old man was Dr. Phelps from the medical clinic. And there were 2 others. A young woman carrying a sleeping infant, and a man about Ray's age whose name he didn't catch. They moved through Milfield like ghosts, keeping to backyards and side streets, avoiding the main roads where strange sound echoed in the darkness. The town Ray had known was gone, replaced by something from a nightmare. Cars sat abandoned in driveways, their doors hanging open. Windows were broken in some houses. Others sat dark and silent as tombs. But it was the smell that got him. A sweet, cloying odor like flowers left too long in a vase, mixed with something else, something organic and wrong. "How many?" Ray whispered to Sarah as they crouched behind a garden shed, waiting for a signal to cross Maple Street. "Changed? Most of the town, far as we can tell. Started around 6 this morning. Spread fast. Real fast. What caused it?" Sarah's face was grim in the moonlight. "Nobody knows. Government's not saying much, assuming there's still a government. All we know is it's spreading, and it's not just here. Radio chatter suggests it's hitting small towns all over New England." They reached the elementary school without incident, a low brick building that had been Ray's daughter's first school, back when she was 6 and the world made sense. A few windows glowed with dim light, and Ray could see movement inside. The main entrance was barricaded, but Sarah led them to a side door where a man with a hunting rifle stood guard. He recognized Sarah and let them in with obvious relief. Inside, Ray counted maybe 30 people, all that was left with Milfield's 3,000 residents. They turned the gymnasium into a makeshift command center, with maps spread on tables and a complex radio set up in one corner. Someone had raided the cafeteria for food and water, and sleeping bags were scattered around the edges of the room. But it was the map that drew Ray's attention. It was covered with red pins, each one marking a town or city that had gone silent. There were a lot of red pins, spreading outward from Boston like ripples in a pond. "It's moving north," said a man Ray didn't recognize, someone from out of town. "Following the highways, the population centers. Whatever this is, it's organized." "Not whatever," said Dr. Phelps, settling heavily into a folding chair. "Whoever. This didn't just happen. This was done to us." The room went quiet. Outside, something howled, long and mournful and definitely not human. "The thing is," Dr. Phelps continued, "I've been thinking about the progression, the way it spreads. 6 a.m. sharp, like someone threw a switch. Every house, every person, all at once. You can't do that with a virus or a chemical agent. This was something else." Like what? The young mother asked, her baby stirring restless in her arms. Like invasion, said Sarah. Something's been planning this for a long time. They debated theories through the night. Government experiments, alien contact, religious apocalypse, but nothing explained the sheer impossibility of what they'd witnessed. How do you turn an entire town's population into gray-skinned, black-eyed things in a matter of hours? How do you coordinate that kind of change across hundreds of miles? Dawn came gray and cheerless through the gymnasium's high windows. The radio crackled with fewer voices than the night before. The red pin on the map had multiplied during the night as reports came in from other survivor groups. The infection, invasion, whatever it was, had reached Portland, Bangor, and pushing north toward Canada. We need to move, Sarah announced. Head for the Canadian border. Try to get across before this thing spreads there too. What about the military? Someone asked. The National Guard? Sarah's expression was grim. Last radio contact was 3 hours ago. It sounded like they were falling back. They spent the morning gathering supplies. Food, water, weapons, medical equipment from the school nurse's office. Ray found himself paired with Billy Morrison, the teenager with the baseball bat, loading canned goods into backpacks. You ever seen something like this before? Billy asked. In the war, I mean. Ray considered the question. War is different. War has rules, even when it doesn't. This, he gestured toward the windows, toward the silent town beyond. This is something else entirely, kid. They were almost ready to leave when the screaming started. It was coming from outside, high and inhuman, like the sound Mrs. Henderson had made. But this was louder, multiple voices joining in a chorus that made the windows vibrate. Sarah grabbed her rifle and ran to the window. Shit, they're back! Ray joined her at the window and felt his blood turn to ice water. The school was surrounded. Hundreds of the gray creatures stood in perfect rows across the playground, the parking lot, the street beyond. All of them perfectly still. All of them staring at the building with those black, oil-slick eyes. But these weren't the shambling, broken puppet figures from yesterday. These moved with fluid grace, standing straighter, looking more aware. Whatever process had changed them was continuing, evolving. At the front of the crowd stood a figure Ray recognized. Mayor Patricia Walsh, her business suit now gray as concrete, her carefully styled hair hanging limp across a face that no longer quite human. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the walls. Come out, she said, and her words had a quality that made Ray's teeth ache. Come out and join us. The change is beautiful. The change is necessary. Jesus Christ, someone whispered. Come out, the mayor repeated. There is no pain, there is no fear. There is only the song. As if summoned by her words, that deep thrumming began again, rising from the earth itself, making the building shake. Ray felt it in his bones, in his blood, and for just a moment, just one terrible moment, he wanted to go outside. He wanted to walk among those gray figures and let whatever had taken them take him too. The feeling passed, but he could see it in the faces around him, that others were feeling it too. We have to go, Sarah said urgently. Now, while we still can. The school had an old bomb shelter in the basement, left over from Cold War paranoia. It connected to the town's storm drain system, which might give them a way out. Ray found himself thinking of his grandfather's stories about World War II, about resistance fighters moving through sewers and tunnels, always one step ahead of the enemy. Except this enemy was everyone they'd ever known, everyone they'd ever loved. The group moved through the basement corridors like a funeral procession. The thrumming sound followed them, seeming to come from the very walls. Behind them, they could hear the creatures entering the school, not breaking down doors, but opening them, moving through the building with purposeful intelligence. They reached the storm drains as the first gray figures appeared at the far end of the basement corridor. Ray was the last one through the narrow opening, and as he pulled the heavy grate closed behind him, He caught a glimpse of Mayor Walsh's face in the dim light. She was smiling, and her teeth were definitely sharper than they'd been yesterday. The storm drains were a nightmare of claustrophobia and stagnant water. But they led north, away from town. The group crawled and waded through the tunnels for what felt like hours, guided only by Sarah's compass and the occasional glimpse of gray light through storm grates above. When they finally emerged, they were 3 miles outside Milfield, in a wooded area near the lake where Ray used to go fishing. The sun was high overhead, but the light still had that thin, stretched quality he had noticed the first morning. From their vantage point on the hill, they could see Milfield spread out below them. The town looked normal. Houses, streets, the white steeple of the Methodist church where Reverend Pike had preached until yesterday. But there was no movement, no life. It was like looking at a photograph of a place that used to exist. "Where do we go now?" the young mother asked. Her baby had been crying sporadically throughout their escape, but the sound was muffled and wrong, as if even the child sensed that noise might bring death. Sarah consulted her map. Canadian border is 50 miles north. If we avoid the highways, stick to back roads and woods, maybe we can make it. They walked through the afternoon, a ragged line of refugees carrying everything they'd owned in backpacks and shopping bags. Ray's knee ached, but he pushed through it. Staying alive was better than being comfortable. They'd gone maybe 10 miles when they saw the smoke. It was rising from the direction of Madison, the next town north. Black, oily smoke that stained the sky and carried the smell of burning plastic and something else. Something organic. "That's not good," Sarah muttered. They climbed another hill and could see Madison clearly. The town was burning. Not out of control, but systematically, building by building, as if someone was conducting a very thorough urban renewal project and moving through the streets. Clearly visible, even at this distance, were more of the gray figures. Ray felt something break inside his chest. A small but vital hope he hadn't realized he was carrying. If Madison was gone. If this thing had spread that far. "How far to Canada?" he asked. "Still 40 miles, Sarah said quietly. That night, they made camp in an abandoned barn, taking turns on watch. Ray drew the midnight shift and spent 2 hours staring out at the darkness, listening to sounds that didn't belong in the New England woods. Mechanical clicking, distant singing in languages he didn't recognize, and underneath it all, that persistent thrumming. The baby died during the night. Ray heard the young mother's stifled scream and knew immediately what had happened. When dawn came, they found the infant gray and still. Its eyes opened to reveal the same black emptiness they'd seen in all the others. "It's airborne," Dr. Fell said grimly. "Or in the water. Maybe both." "How long?" Sarah asked. "Hard to say. Children first, probably because their immune systems are still developing. Then the elderly, the sick. But we're all infected now. It's just a matter of time." They buried the baby in the woods, using Billy's baseball bat to scrape out a shallow grave. The young mother, Ray realized, he'd never even learned her name, knelt by the tiny mound of earth and didn't make a sound. After that, they didn't talk much. They walked north through a world that was slowly and systematically dying. Every town they passed was either burning or silent. Sometimes they saw groups of the gray figures moving with purpose, always heading south, always in perfect formation. Once, they hid in a creek bed while a convoy of military vehicles passed on the highway above them. But the soldiers driving the vehicles had black eyes and skin like concrete. By the fourth day, Dr. Phelps was dead. Ray found him that morning, sitting upright against a tree, gray and still, his medical bag clutched in his hands. His eyes were still human, brown, kind, exhausted. But when Ray checked his pulse, there was nothing. Within an hour, Dr. Phelps opened those black eyes and tried to grab Billy Morrison's ankle. Sarah put him down with a single rifle shot that echoed across the hills like a thunderclap. They were 8 miles from the Canadian border when the singing started. It began as just a whisper on the wind, but grew stronger as they climbed toward the ridge that marked the international boundary. It was beautiful and terrible, a harmony that made Ray think of church choirs and funeral dirges and lullabies his mother used to sing. But underneath the beauty was something else. A compulsion, a command that worked its way into his brain like a parasite. "Come home," the song seemed to say. "Come home and join us. Come home and sleep." Billy Morrison stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the trail, his baseball bat hanging loose in his grip, his head tilted as he was listening to something only he could hear. "Billy," Sarah called. "Billy, we need to move." But Billy was changing. Ray could see it happening. The color draining from his face, his eyes growing dark, his posture straightening into that too rigid stance they learned to recognize. Sarah raised her rifle, but Ray put a hand on her arm. "Wait." Billy turned toward them, and his eyes were still human, still frightened. "I can hear them," he whispered. "They're calling. They say it doesn't hurt." "Fight it," Ray said. "You can fight it, son." Billy smiled, and Ray saw the boy he'd been, the kid who'd been delivering papers on Saturday mornings, who'd helped his mother carry groceries, who'd never hurt anyone in his short life. "I'm so tired," Billy said. Then his eyes went black, and he raised the baseball bat. Sarah's rifle shot took him down before he could swing. The sound echoed off the hills, and somewhere in the distance, voices answered. Hundreds of them, thousands, all singing that terrible lullaby. There were only 6 of them left. Ray, Sarah, the unnamed young mother, and 3 others whose names he'd never learned. They crested the ridge as the sun was setting, and there before them was the border, a simple line of signs and markers, and beyond that, Canada. Canada was burning too. They could see the smoke rising from a dozen towns across the valley, the same systematic destruction they'd witnessed in Maine. And moving along the highways in both directions were rivers of gray figures, all heading south, all singing that hypnotic song. "It's everywhere," one of the others said. "The whole world." Ray thought about his daughter in Portland, his ex-wife in Seattle, his brother in Denver. All gone, probably. All changed. The world he'd known for 62 years had ended in less than a week, replaced by something that looked the same but was fundamentally different. They made camp on the ridge that night, in full view of the border they'd traveled so far to reach. No one talked about what they'd do tomorrow. No one talked about anything. Ray took the last watch, from 4 to dawn. He sat with his back against the pine tree, the shotgun across his knees, and watched the sun rise over a world that was no longer his. The young one was the first to change. Ray saw her eyes go dark as the morning light touched her face. She looked at him with something that might have been apology, then stood and began walking south, back toward Milfield, back toward whatever was calling them all home. One by one, the others followed. Sarah held out the longest, fighting the change with every ounce of strength she had. She pressed the rifle into Ray's hands just before her eyes went black. "Don't let them take you," she whispered. "Don't let them." Then she was gone, walking south with the others, leaving Ray alone on the ridge. Ray sat there all morning, watching them disappear into the distance. The singing grew stronger as the day progressed, more insistent, more beautiful. It promised rest, peace, an end to the fear and loneliness and pain. All he had to do was set down the gun and walk south. Instead, Ray Brennan stood up, checked his watch, 10:47 a.m., October 21st, and began walking north. He crossed into Canada around noon, though the border meant nothing now. The road was empty except for abandoned cars and the occasional gray figure heading south. None of them paid him any attention. He was alone, harmless, irrelevant. Ray walked for 3 days through a world that was systematically returning to silence. He saw cities burning in the distance, aircraft falling from the sky, the lights of civilization going dark one by one. But he kept walking north, away from the singing, away from the gathering gray tide that was consuming everything behind him. On the 4th day, he found a cabin by a lake in what used to be Quebec. The owners were gone, changed or dead. It didn't matter which. Ray barricaded the doors, covered the windows, and settled in to wait. For what? He wasn't sure. The radio had been silent for days, but Ray kept trying, scanning the frequencies for any sign that someone, somewhere, was still fighting, still human, still alive. On the 7th day, he heard a voice. It was faint and crackling with static, but definitely human. A woman's voice, speaking French accented English from somewhere far to the north.
This is Dr. Mary Dubois, broadcasting from the Polar Research Station. Coordinates 82 degrees north, 74 degrees west. If anyone can hear this, we have 12 people here, all uninfected. Repeat, 12 people still uninfected. The change seems to be temperature sensitive. Below -20 Celsius, the organism becomes dormant. If anyone receives this transmission, head north. Head as far north as you can go.
Ray listened to the transmission repeat 3 more times before it faded into static. He tried calling back, but his radio wasn't powerful enough to reach that far. 12 people, maybe more in other Arctic outposts, research stations, isolated communities in Greenland or Alaska or Siberia. Not many, but enough. Enough to keep the species alive, if they could survive long enough for whatever this was happening to the world to run its course. Ray looked at his maps. The research station Dr. Dubois mentioned was over 1,000 miles away, across some of the most hostile terrain in North America. He was 62 years old, overweight, with a bad knee and no Arctic survival experience. He'd never make it. But maybe someone else would. Someone younger, stronger, better prepared. Maybe that voice in the darkness would find its way to other survivors. Other refugees fleeing the gray tide that had swallowed the world. Ray spent his last days writing. He filled notebook after notebook with everything he could remember. How it started, how it spread, the symptoms of the change, the behavior of the infected, scientific observations mixed with personal memories. The kind of record that might help someone, someday, understand what had happened to humanity. He buried the notebooks in a metal box behind the cabin, along with his maps and radio frequencies, and Dr. Dubois' coordinates. Then he sat on the cabin's front porch, facing south, and waited. The singing reached him on the 10th day, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind from hundreds of miles away. It was more beautiful than ever, more compelling, promising not just rest but reunion with everyone he'd ever known. His parents, his ex-wife, his daughter, all the friends and neighbors who'd taken in their first terrible hours. All he had to do was walk south and join them. Ray listened to the song for a long time. Then he went inside, locked the door, and turned the radio up loud enough to drown it out. He held up for 3 more days. When the change finally took him, Ray Brennan was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his father's old shotgun. His last conscious thought was a prayer that someone would find his notebooks, that his death might serve some small purpose in keeping the human story alive. The gray figure that had been Ray stood up from the table, set down the empty coffee mug, and began a long walk south. Behind him, the radio continued broadcasting to an empty room, static punctuated by the occasional voice calling into the void, growing fainter with each passing day. By winter, the voice has stopped entirely. But somewhere in the deep Arctic, where the cold was too bitter for the change to take hold, 12 people huddled around heaters and rationed food and wondered if they were the last humans left alive. They took turns monitoring the radio frequencies, hoping against hope to hear another voice, Another sign that somewhere in the vast silence, someone like them was still fighting, still human, still alive. Dr. Mary Dubois never heard Ray Brennan's story, but in the spring, if spring ever came again, she would lead an expedition south to look for survivors. They would find abandoned cities and empty towns, but they would also find Ray's metal box buried behind a cabin by a lake, and inside it, the careful observations of a mail carrier from Maine who lived to see the end of the world and died trying to help those who might witness its beginning again. The notebooks would become the foundation of humanity's understanding of what had happened during those terrible days in October. Scholars in the New World, if there was to be a New World, would study Ray Brennan's words and wonder at the courage of a man who'd walked alone through the apocalypse, with nothing but coffee-stained observations and stubborn hope. That was still far in the future, beyond the endless Arctic winter that settled over the world like a blanket. For now, there was only the cold and the waiting, and the fading hope that somewhere in the silence, other voices were calling back. The last light of Milfield had gone out with Ray Brennan, but in the Arctic darkness, other lights still burned. Small flames against an endless night, but flames nonetheless, carrying with them everything that had ever made humanity worth saving, and everything that might make it worth rebuilding. The gray tide would recede eventually, as all tides do. The question was whether anyone would be left to see it happen. In her research station, Dr. Mary Dubois adjusted her radio one more time and spoke into the microphone, her breath visible in the frigid air.
This is Dr. Dubois, day 43. If anyone can hear this, we're still here. We're still human, and we're not giving up.
Her words traveled across the frozen wasteland, carried by radio waves into a world that had forgotten how to listen. But in a cabin somewhere in northern Alaska, another survivor heard those words and picked up her own microphone.
Dr. Dubois, this is Captain James Mitchell, U.S. Coast Guard. I copy you loud and clear.
One by one, other voices joined the conversation. A family in Greenland, a research team in Antarctica, a group of Inuit hunters who'd been ice fishing when the world changed and had stayed on the ice ever since, somehow untouched by the great tide. Not many voices. Perhaps a few hundred scattered across the polar regions of a planet that had held 7 billion souls just weeks before. But enough. Enough to begin again. In the spring, when spring finally came, and the warming air began to stir the dormant organisms in the blood that changed, the survivors would venture south. They would find a world transformed. Empty cities slowing before reclaimed by nature. Vast graveyards of the grave figures who had simply stopped moving when the thing that controlled them completed whatever purpose had brought it to Earth. They would find Ray Brennan's notebooks and the thousands of similar records left by other observers who had lived through humanity's last days. They would piece together the story of those terrible October weeks, and they would build monuments to the courage of ordinary people who had faced the impossible and left behind whatever wisdom they could gather. But most importantly, they would survive. They would remember. And in time, they would ensure that when the next tide came, as such tides inevitably did in a universe full of dark wonders, humanity would be ready. The last light of Milfield was gone, but dawn was coming. And Ray Brennan's words, buried in the frozen ground beside a lake in Quebec, would be there to greet them. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that story. Come back next time for some more scary stories. And as always, remember to face your fears.